You ever feel like a failure? Like you just can't measure up no matter how you try, no matter what you try? I've been there. Let's talk about why feeling like a failure is so common, particularly for those of us who are leaders. And I want to share with you how to handle it when it shows up. Because today on the Calm and Confident Leader, we're going to talk about you are not a failure. You are not a failure. And I'll tell you, every now and again, I have these extreme feelings of being a failure. Now, I could sit here and parade all of the accomplishments and books I've written and things I've done and all of that kind of stuff and been leading for more than 30 plus years. But I'll tell you, when I get this feeling of feeling like a failure, it causes me to spiral in such a negative and depressing way that pretty much paralyzes me. And I have these certain outcomes or expectations that I put on myself. And when those don't turn out the way that I think they should have, um, man, it is not a good day. It is not a good thing. And sometimes it's much more than a day, as you guys know. Sometimes it happens for weeks and weeks where you are in this pit and you just can't seem to get out. So why does it happen? What is true about failure? Why do these feelings overwhelm us so? And how can we start to find a pathway forward? Well, why you feel like a failure. I think the root cause of why I feel like a failure oftentimes, it comes from unmet expectations. Unmet expectations. Our expectations, others' expectations, society's expectations. So let's talk about them. Societal expectations. This is that pressure that we all feel to align with what is quote unquote normal. Like what is normal for a career path? What is normal for family life? What is normal for financial success? And when you have these expectations of what everybody else seems to know already, what everybody else seems to be doing already, how everybody else seems to be crushing it already, and you feel like I'm not hitting those expectations. And you know what? It doesn't take more than one of those areas to make you feel like a failure or to cause you to feel like a failure, I should say. Because I can just start to feel this way as a dad and feel like, man, I am not matching up. I am not the dad I wanted to be. I'm not the dad I hope to be. And my kids are not responding the way that I would love for them to respond. And maybe that has to do with me. And maybe I'm not doing my part. You see how quickly these thoughts can start to spiral? Or I can start to look at that in my career and think, hey, by this point, I should be making X amount of money. I should be able to do this. I should be able to do that. Everybody else seems to be crushing it. And what do we tend to do? We tend to compare our blooper reel to everybody else's highlight reel, right? We look at social media, we look at maybe just the circles that we tend to travel in, and we say, man, I'm just not matching up. I'm just not fitting in. I'm just not keeping up with where everybody else is. And so those societal expectations, again, expectations that we've never agreed to, yet they can cause us to feel like a failure. Second type of expectation that is really, I think, at the root of these feelings is others' expectations. Friends, family members, maybe even supervisors have their own ideals for us, what they expect of us, what they would think, and those, by the way, though their expectations are often formed from their own history, maybe things that they saw their dad or their mom or they saw their mom and dad acting this way, and so this is the way they anticipated marriage being, or this is the way they saw their parents parent, and so this is what they expect of you, or or there is this expectations of a supervisor to say, hey, we put ourselves out there and we hired you and we expected that you were going to be able to do the jobs of three different people. And you're like, I'm only one person. But for some reason they thought, we're gonna push all this money into the middle and we're gonna hire you because we think you're gonna be able to do the job of three people. And so you have these expectations that others put on you, again, friends, family members, supervisors, and they may be unrealistic. Often, I will tell you this, often they are unspoken. So nobody really tells you, hey, this is the expectations I have of you because they don't want to overwhelm you or they just think you should know it already. And yet there's something inside of us that feels driven to try to meet those expectations because let's be honest, these are people who matter to us. These are friends. These are family members. These are supervisors who hold our job, right? And if we don't meet their expectations, we could lose the job. We could be ostracized from the family, or at least we could experience some form of rejection. That's at the root of a lot of these expectations, isn't there? What if I don't meet these expectations? Well, that means you might reject me. Or what if you're a potential employer and I'm interviewing for the job and I'm hoping that I'm doing everything that you expect and what you're looking for? And it may or may not be a good fit, but gosh darn it, I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that you think I'm the greatest possible employee that you could hire. And what happens if you don't? Well, now I'm dealing with rejection. And it's often personal. It's not because I wasn't the right fit. It's because I'm not good enough. It's because I don't have enough value, enough worth. You don't see, maybe you don't see the full picture. You don't see who I am. You don't see what I could do for your company. And so those others' expectations cause us to act in many ways beyond who we are. We expect to be a superhuman to meet those expectations, and we're so afraid of not meeting those expectations because if I don't, then you'll reject me. And so typically what happens, by the way, when you don't meet others' expectations, is it becomes challenging. We'll talk about actually all of these expectations and what happens when we don't meet them in just a second. But let me get to the third category because I think the third category is very significant and probably the biggest reason why we often feel like failures. And that is because of self-expectations. Self-expectations. These are often the toughest because of our own personal standards, our own personal ideals. And when we don't meet our own expectations, this can lead us to all kinds of negative things. Because we have for ourselves a standard in our mind, a desired outcome, or an ideal of who we want to be. I'll tell you, this has been a personal one for me recently. I can see this person, right? I can see this picture of this man I want to be, of this leader I want to be, of this husband I want to be, of this dad I want to be. I have all of these ideals in my mind, and I'm thinking, oh, it's just right there. I feel like I could reach out and grab it, but it just seems to be right out of reach. And so when I don't meet those expectations that I have of myself, I tend to go one of two directions, and you probably too as well. I either rationalize or justify why I didn't achieve that outcome, which essentially makes us the victim, doesn't it? Or it makes us confident and like, I didn't really want that job anyway. I didn't really want that situation anyway. It's their loss. But really, all I'm doing is masking these feelings of inadequacy, or I'm rationalizing or justifying why I did that and why I messed that up and why I sent that extra email or made the extra text message or made the extra phone call, somehow trying to manage the fact that, yeah, I screwed up. I came on too aggressive, or I was too forthright, or whatever it might be in your case. is I rationalize and justify, and I don't know about you, but I am the king of rationalization. I can talk myself into or out of anything. Well, the other direction that I go sometimes when those expectations or those outcomes are not met is I start spiraling. I start spiraling downward. I become depressed. I feel like a failure. And I begin to say things like, why would anyone love me? Or how will I ever be able to get to those desired outcomes that I have for my life? And I'm going to be stuck here forever. No one will ever allow me to do that. Because look at my life and look at my track record, and all of a sudden, what only fills your mind are all the things that you didn't do up to your expectations, what your level of par is. And all of a sudden, your mind is flooded with all of these cases to back up, all of these instances and examples and situations that back up the fact that, yes, you are a failure. Look at it. Look at the track record. You just keep messing up. And then you start to beat yourself up, which tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because now you become somebody who is nothing like that person you want to be. Now you're moping all the time. You're depressed all the time. You're feeling like a failure. And so you essentially sabotage yourself. You take yourself out of conversations. You take yourself out of opportunities. You don't apply for those kinds of jobs anymore because obviously you're not capable, you're not equipped, you're not at that level anymore because you're a failure. Am I resonating with anybody? Maybe I'm just talking to myself. So what is true about failure? What is the bottom line when it comes to failure? Because there seems to be all these expectations and societal and self and personal expectations that you have. And what is the truth? What is truth? Well, let's talk about it this way. Failure is often about how we interpret our experiences. Let me say that again. Failure is often about how we interpret our experiences. What one person sees as a failure, another sees as a learning opportunity. So what do we do with that? Failure, I would propose to you, is a whole lot more about what you're seeing, about your perspective, and about how you're interpreting what's happened, and not about the actual thing. See, in order to understand the truth about failure, I have to do two things. I have to, number one, I have to see the full picture. Because if failure is about my perspective, then it's about what I'm seeing. And if you're anything like me, you're only seeing your bloopers right now. You're only seeing your mistakes right now. You're only seeing the things that you didn't do right. And can I just take a quick aside here? How many of those expectations from society or from others did you even sign off on? How many of those expectations of society or others are even realistic? Like that any human being could achieve what that person expects. And let me just pile on here and say, you have your expectations, your kids have their expectations, your wife or your husband have their expectations, your supervisor has their expectations. They only see their one set of expectations for you as their dad, as their husband, as their wife, as their employee or supervisor, whatever, right? So you are feeling all of those expectations piled on top of one another. And maybe, and this is a far reach, maybe you could fulfill the expectations of your spouse Or maybe you could fulfill the expectations of your supervisor, but in so doing, you would have to fail at the expectations of your family because the expectations of your supervisor maybe has you working 90 hours a week and at a completely unsustainable pace that would essentially guarantee the failure of your marriage and the estrangement of your kids. But yeah, maybe you could fulfill those expectations, although I think that's a far reach anyway. But in order to fulfill all of those, no human being could do that. And so we don't test those expectations. We violate our own boundaries. And again, I'm not even talking about your own self expectations here. I'm just talking about society and others. But even if we just took those two, there's no way we can meet all of those expectations. And so, are you really a failure? So what I want to say first of all is in order to start to find a way out of those feelings or a way forward, even though you are feeling those things, is the first thing is we're going to have to learn to find a way to see the full picture and ask ourselves some really important questions like, were there factors that were beyond your control? Were there things that you had no control over, you had no say over, and yet you are beating yourself up for not hitting it when there were certain things that you couldn't control? Like that company that you were trying to get that job at, they may have a whole bunch of issues that they're dealing with that have nothing to do with you. And you might be what they need, but they, because of their own issues, they can't see that you're what they need right now. So you're blaming yourself because you failed on the job interview, and it may have very little to do with you and more to do with that company. Or it may have very little to do with that person you're in relationship with, but they have their own set of baggage and woundedness and things that have hurt them in their life that really have nothing to do with you. So we've got to find a way to see the full picture. Another question you might ask yourself under seeing the full picture is, were any of your expectations that you had on yourself, were any of those expectations unrealistic? Or were you unaware of your own limits and maybe what should be your own boundaries that you set for yourself, but you're violating them left and right? Second thing I would say, as far as a way forward, is you've got to do some self-assessment. You've got to do some self-assessment. Look, you're trying to beat yourself up anyway. Well, then do a little reflection. Because I'll tell you, the big difference between really healthy leaders and unhealthy leaders is this issue, and I've talked about it before on this podcast, of reflection. Healthy leaders have learned to add a rhythm of reflection into their life. Unhealthy leaders rarely take an internal look. And so, what does that look like? Well, on this context of failure, I would encourage you maybe to ask yourself some questions like these. Are there some fears or insecurities that may have affected my actions? Look, you may be feeling some of those feelings of failure because you poorly responded to your own fears of rejection, your own fear of will they find out, your imposter syndrome, for example, your insecurities around your ability to communicate or whatever it might be. So, are there some fears or some insecurities that you need to work through and you need to get on the other side of? Because if you leave these fears and insecurities where they are, they will continue to sabotage you and they will continue to cause you to behave badly. And I'm telling you this from personal experience. I look at the anxiety and the fear that has dominated large portions, large seasons of my life. And I look at the fallout that that fear has had on me. And it is, I can't even begin to go there. And, and yeah, could you say I was a failure in those cases? In some ways, yes, because I chose to act from a place of fear. And because of my actions trying to compensate for my fear, I made some bad choices. I behaved in ways that were not who I wanted to be. And so, yeah, was that failure? I guess so. I'm looking at it today as saying maybe that's an opportunity for me to grow. Maybe there's some fears and insecurities that I need to work through with a good therapist, a counselor, an executive coach who can help me understand those fears. And I am doing this work, by the way, so that those fears don't sabotage me because they've taken way too much from my life. All right, enough on the soapbox. Another question for self-assessment. Is there a skill or a competency gap that I could improve that could improve my outcomes next time? The reality is you didn't get the job. The reality is you missed out on showing up for your kid, or you missed out in a conversation with your spouse. It could be that you need to grow in your empathy. It could be that you need to talk a lot less and learn how to listen and listen with active listening, which again, we're not going to get to in this particular episode, but it's an important skill for us to learn. And there could be some competency gaps, some skill gaps in who you are as a person that you could actually get better at so that next time you're not in the same situation because you were able to add or grow in those skills or competencies. An option for you to consider. Now, again, if you're beating yourself up, oh, I'm a failure. Oh, I always do this. This never works out well for me. I'm always making these poor choices. If you go down that road, there's going to be no growth, no improvement, and you're going to find yourself going around the block and doing this all over again next time. But if you say, I'm not going to look at this as a failure, but I'm going to look at this as a growth opportunity, well, then you can start to ask some of these really good questions that we've been talking about, and they will really make a huge difference. Here's another one that I want to give you for self-assessment, and then we're going to move on from here. But let me give you one more question. Could I have asked for help, and would that have made a difference? See, one of the things I find, particularly in young leaders, is we're so desiring to prove ourselves that sometimes we don't ask for help from other people who are really good in those areas that there may be a gap in. And by the way, they're people that you could talk with before you get into the situation that would prepare you and teach you, train you even, so that you don't have an issue. So for example, I'm going to go into a job interview, right? We've been talking about that. If I go into a job interview, could I talk to some people and know what kind of questions I'm going to be asked and who could speak to me and help me frame my weaknesses, for example, right? That's one of the age-old questions that shows up in a job interview. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And everybody wants to say, oh, I just work too hard. Now, come on. You've got to be honest about that answer. But there's a way to frame the answer of your weaknesses in a way that's actually helpful rather than a way that just is laying down under the bus or trying to justify or rationalize yourself. So just a thought there. All right. So in order to look at the true picture, we've got to see the full picture and we need to do a self-assessment. So let me see if I can summarize what we've learned today. And then I'm going to give you one bonus thought that you don't have to stay for. But let me at least summarize by giving you some practical tips to handling when you feel like a failure. Number one, reframe your perspective. Reframe your perspective. See the setbacks that come in your life as steps in a journey. Real growth is going to come from embracing your challenges. So reframe your perspective. That's number one. Number two, question your expectations. Question your expectations. Regularly assess if your goals align with what's achievable and meaningful to you. not just to other people. So question those expectations. Number 3, practice self-compassion. Practice self-compassion. Treat yourself with kindness. It's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to learn from your mistakes without self-punishment. Number 4, set boundaries with yourself. Set boundaries with yourself. Protect your time and your energy. Avoid stretching yourself too thin and trying to meet every unrealistic expectation that's out there. And then number 5, celebrate the small wins. I am horrible at this, but this is such a critical piece to living out of a place of abundance rather than the scarcity failure mindset that so many of us live with. Celebrate small wins. Recognize your incremental progress, not just focus on the big achievements and the big outcomes. Recognize your incremental progress and celebrate those small wins. Now, that's where the podcast can end for most of you. But some of you know this, maybe many of you do, I don't know. But in addition to my coaching and my content creation and working with people in the marketplace, executives and entrepreneurs, I'm also a pastor. I'm also a person of faith. And I thought I would just share a perspective about that or from that place that I think will be really helpful in this topic. But I do want to say this. These channels that I'm posting this on and my work with executives and entrepreneurs, I am very, very careful not to use this as a way to proselytize or try to push a faith on other people that are not interested in it. And so I know that, and that's why I'm saying if you need to turn it off now, that's fine. But personally, I think there is some perspective, there is some richness to life because of my faith in Jesus. And handling failure, I think, is one of the greatest aspects of my Christian faith. And so that's why I felt like I need to share this with you. And let me just kind of, all right, that's enough preface, that's enough disclaimer. I really want this for you, by the way. But again, like I said, I really don't want to be pushy about it, but I need you to know this, and you'll resonate with this. Deep inside of every human being is a desire to be accepted and loved. It is something implanted deep within every human being I meet. And because of that desire to be accepted and to be loved, there is a deep fear of being rejected and seen as worthless. Now, as a person of faith and as a pastor, I believe that all human beings are created in the image of God. Not only that, but we are seen as so valuable to God that he sent his son Jesus to die for us, to die for the brokenness and for the sin, that's the word the Bible uses, of all humanity. Jesus came to die, to be a sacrifice, to be a substitute, to stand in our place for our sin and our brokenness. And so that deep-seated fear of rejection that every human being feels is because you and I live in a fallen and sinful world, which is why Jesus had to die, why Jesus had to become a sacrifice for that sin. And the reason I believe that we are not all benefiting from this is because God does not push himself on us, which, by the way, is a large reason why I don't talk much or try to push my faith in these marketplace channels that we're on. However, I can't deny that the thing that you and I long for most is found, I believe, inside of relationship and connection with Jesus. Let me say that again. I believe that the thing that you and I long for the most, that love, that acceptance, that unconditional acceptance and love, is found inside of a relationship and deep connection with Jesus. Now, again, God doesn't force himself and doesn't force it, that relationship. He doesn't force that relationship on anyone. But here's the good news. He makes it available to anyone who will seek him. He makes it available to anyone who will seek him. Our worth as human beings goes well beyond our performance. Even for those of us who kind of grew up in church, our worth goes well beyond our religious performance and our religious duty as well. So, where do you get that? Well, maybe not where do I get that, but let me just read these words. It's from the Bible in the book of Romans, chapter 8. And this is from the Passion version of the Bible, which I think really puts it in a way that I think will be accessible for most of us listening or watching today. Romans chapter 8, verse 15 to 17 says this. This is the Apostle Paul, a guy who grew up around religious faith and was so committed to his religious faith that he thought that's going to be the pathway to my acceptance. But then he has this experience, this relationship that he connects with Jesus. And this is now what he says. And I think it's the words that you and I need to hear today, particularly those of us who are fearing rejection and fearing failure. This is what he says in Romans 8, starting with verse 15. And you did not receive the spirit of religious duty when you became a Christian, when you became a follower of Jesus, when you began relationship with him. You didn't receive a spirit of religious duty that leads you back into the fear of never being good enough. But, he says, you have received the spirit of full acceptance, enfolding you into the family of God. And you will never feel orphaned. For as he rises up within us, our spirits join him in saying the words of tender affection, beloved Father, Father God. For the Holy Spirit, which, by the way, the Bible says that the Holy Spirit indwells or lives in everyone who begins this relationship with Jesus. For the Holy Spirit makes God's fatherhood real to us as he whispers into our innermost being, you are God's beloved child. And since we are his true children, we qualify to share all his treasures. For indeed, we are heirs of God himself. And since we are joined to Christ, to Jesus, we also inherit all that he is and all that he has. We will experience being co-glorified with him, provided we accept his sufferings as our own. You see, there's this beautiful relationship with God himself where he sees you as his child. And as his child, we can't be fired, right? You're not fired from your family. You can't be fired for poor performance or even for failure. We are in his family, and therefore we start from a place of love, not a place of performance, and not a place of perform or else. That what sets us free to experience the fullness and the richness and a high definition, full color life is because of our relationship with Jesus. Therefore, through faith, we can find the security to face failure with resilience. We are loved and valued not because of what we do, but because of who we are as children of God, starting from a place of love rather than place of pressure. So look, you are not a failure. Listen, You are not a failure. Setbacks and struggles are part of the journey. So let's use them to grow and to become better versions of ourselves. Now, if this episode of the podcast was helpful, I would love it if you would share it with other people, if you would comment on whatever platform that you're using, you'd like it, whatever you do. And I would definitely invite you to subscribe so that you can hear more insights just like the ones you've heard in this one on overcoming those setbacks and living with purpose. And if you'd like more information on all of this stuff, I would invite you to join me over on my website, jasonstonehouse.com, jasonstonehouse.com. I've got all my books there. I've got a bunch of free tools. In fact, one of the things I didn't mention in the episode was I actually have a fear assessment on my website that will allow you to understand what fears you may be dealing with and how those fears are exhibiting themselves. It's completely free. It's over on jasonstonehouse.com. Just scroll down on the homepage and you'll see it right there. All right. So join me over there and join me for the next episode of The Calm and Confident Leader. And remember, life is a process, so don't do it alone.